British Columbia had its election on Saturday, and we have a new majority government. John Horgan is no longer leading a minority government. He's now the premier of a majority government, with a healthy majority, actually. And to discuss that and what it means for energy and climate, we're going to talk to Stewart Prest, who is a professor of political science at the Simon Fraser University. So welcome to the interview, Stewart.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me on.
Look, why don't we just start with you give us your reaction to the election, and did this pretty much go as you thought it would, or any surprises, wrinkles?
It was certainly in line with the polls we were seeing coming into the election, and even prior to this is why we had the election, was that the NDP were polling very well. There was a lot of support for what they had been doing during the pandemic, and that clearly has just continued on, and if anything, it would strengthen during the campaign. The NDP ran a good, clean campaign. They had a couple of little promises along the way, and they were able to ride that general feeling of goodwill that we've seen for incumbent governments, not just in Canada, but really internationally. When governments take the pandemic seriously, they have tended to be rewarded for that. So New Zealand is an example, New Brunswick is an example, and BC now is a very good example of that.
Well, let's talk about energy and climate, because that's what we're about at Energy Media. Energy really didn't play a role in this campaign. Now, I wrote a column at the beginning of the campaign that argued that it should, and in particular around electricity, because Clean BC, Horgan's climate policy suite, calls for extensive electrification of the economy in order to lower GHG emissions. And the experts that I've talked to say that to meet targets, it'll take way more, like another five Site C dam equivalents of electricity, and the system isn't ready for. BC Hydro isn't up to snuff. The power grid isn't up to snuff. We got a lot of work to do, and in my opinion, that should have been part of the campaign. Not a lot of interest in it.
No, there really wasn't. I mean, we saw that across the board. The issues that tend to dominate British Columbia politics, whether we're talking housing or homelessness or energy or the environment, those are perennial issues, and yet we didn't hear much about any of them. They were there, but they were all sort of playing second fiddle to this clear and present crisis ongoing. And so I think this is what we can expect coming out of the election, is that the NDP is going to more or less continue on in the kind of incremental direction that they have been trying to maintain so far. They really are trying to be a little bit like a federal Liberal equivalent for BC. They're trying to be somewhat middle of the road. So they're trying to reconcile Clean BC and a clean energy plan and a carbon tax on the one hand with development of LNG on the other. And so they're really trying to do that. We can do both. We can walk and chew gum thing. And it's not clear that that's going to be enough to meet the targets that they are setting for themselves. And yet we really didn't have that discussion. The potential climate, earth-changing issues of climate change are there, but they were just in the background, in one of those cases of talking about the urgent rather than the important, I suppose.
Sure, and I guess that's understandable, but these climate and the energy are going to have to get back on the agenda somehow. So how does that happen? I mean, you mentioned that Horgan is kind of a middle of the road. To be honest with you, I spent 20 years in Saskatchewan and was there during the Romano, from '91 to when he stepped down later that decade. And the Horgan government feels a lot like the Romano government did, kind of middle of the road, prairie socialist. Nobody's nationalizing things or running huge deficits, any of that stuff.
No, I mean, when the NDP succeed and they win multiple multiple majorities, or minority and majority in this case, it tends to be on that kind of program where it is change. It is clearly a progressive government. It's we're not seeing rampant privatization or declaring war against the public service or anything like that. But we're not seeing any kind of radical changes in another direction as well. I mean, Gary Dewar fits this mold of government as well, I think. So this seems to be the kind of NDP government that can succeed, but it does lead to a certain limit of ambition on even these truly important files. And even in a partnership with the Green Party, you would think that that would have lit a fire under the NDP, if anything would have, to really go hard on environmental issues. And it really didn't. Clean BC is nice, but as you said, it is just one piece of what needs to be a much larger problem. And yet that is being treated more or less as the centerpiece of the NDP strategy.
Well, one thing that is different about British Columbia is that it has plenty of groups and plenty of people willing to put these issues on the table. And I think of, the environmental groups. We have First Nations who are very concerned about energy and climate issues. We have some firebrands like David Suzuki and Zipporah Berman. I would expect that while they were quiet during the election, that those voices are going to be front and center once again, this fall and over the winter.
Yeah, I would not be surprised. I mean, that is one of the old quips you occasionally hear about politics, right? That an election campaign is no time to talk about policy or debate policy. And so we may see that the NDP they're going to get comfortable. They have 4 years. They are not under this imminent threat that a minority situation entails. And so they can, stretch out a little bit, and they are going to be lobbied. They're going to be pushed by a number of different actors, and they're going to have a little freedom to decide. And I think, to circle back to your previous question, how do we see this issue get back on the agenda? I think it is through this sustained advocacy and of bright lights, those loud voices like David Suzuki and so on, but also this groundswell of what is pretty clearly a true grassroots movement of younger British Columbians who are willing to get involved in politics, not necessarily formal politics, but in engaging in the public sphere through marches, demonstrations, the Fridays for the Future. That was a big deal in Vancouver. We had a series of demonstrations around the time that Greta Thunberg was making her trip through Canada, and it was a real phenomenon. It made it clear that young people are paying attention. And when they are doing so, it's not necessarily going to be in a partisan mode. It's pushing for action on the issues that matter to them. And this is clearly an issue that matters to them. And so I would not be surprised to see the NDP having to find ways to meet that cry out. I think once this current situation subsides, we all hope that we get through a COVID situation soon, we're going to see that jump right back to the top of the agenda.
Last question, Stewart, and let's stick with the issue of the younger generation. And I know you've addressed some of yes, it's a concern for them, but I mean, university, we were undergraduates at one time in our lives, and of course we were radical and angry about stuff and wanted change. But you've been a professor for a while, and you teach these kids all the time, so you're in daily contact with them. Have you noticed a shift over the last few years where climate change and taking serious action, and maybe because of Greta Thunberg, but is that really now has become a real motivating factor or something really serious for these kids?
It really is, and you don't really see much debate in class over whether this is an issue or whether this should be something that government should be dealing with. It's much more of a question of how much, how fast, why on earth does the action not happen more quickly? You don't hear a lot of notes of skepticism. And granted, I teach in an urban setting, and so that is not necessarily going to be reflected, say, in the interior, but a broad cross-section of students living in the Lower Mainland. I've taught at various places, and that's a pretty common theme. It's not just limited to environment. We see it on issues like racial inclusivity, Black Lives Matter movement. There's a lot of interest in these kinds of issues that are more of the matter of social movements rather than partisan politics. But they're the things that grab younger generations' attention, and they are paying attention.
Stewart, thank you very much for this. I always appreciate talking to you, and we'll look forward to chatting with you again in the near future.
I look forward to it as well. Thanks for having me on.